Welcome to Mind Meets Body and Soul, a podcast that connects the dots between clinical mental health and spiritual holistic wellness. I'm Heather, a licensed clinical social worker and mental health guru.
And I'm Devon, a Reiki master, spiritual teacher, and lover of all things woo-woo. We're here to discuss various wellness topics, highlighting the connection between the mind, body, and soul.
We'll be offering nuggets of wisdom from each of our fields with the ultimate goal of bridging the gap between our two worlds. Whether you lean more into cognitive psychology
or flow with the woo-woo waters, we are here to help you prioritize yourself and unlock a fresh perspective to healing, growth, and expansion. We're so excited you're here. Let's jump in.
Hello. Welcome back to episode 7 of Mind Meets Body and Soul. Heather here. Hope everybody's doing well. How's it going, Devon?
Hi, guys. Hi, Heather. I am doing well. How are you?
Good. How was your trip? You just got home, right?
Just got back from Colorado for the week. It was lovely. You know, I love Colorado, love the mountains. It was a mix between business and fun and adventure. So, a great trip overall. And as you know, I am in a process of looking for an apartment out there. So, excited to be out there full time. It's good to see you. It's been a
I know.
week and a half since we've
Too
seen
long.
each other. Too long. We've been meeting weekly, twice weekly since, I guess, early March. So it's funny. I haven't seen you for a week and a half, and I'm like, oh, I've missed you.
I know. I'm like looking at your like little face on my screen, like smiling. I can't. I'm excited. It's good to see you and talk to you again.
Fully agree. We just had an episode launch today. So today we are recording episode 7. Hard to believe that we are almost 2 months into this podcasting journey together, but happy to be here as always.
I want to take a quick second to shout out everyone that listens and all our loyal listeners and followers. We hit 100 plays on Spotify
Yep.
recently, so that was like so cool. And we see you all, we appreciate you all, and we like feel all your love. It's really fun.
Really fun, and couldn't have said it any better. Taking this moment to celebrate you and me, Mind Meets Body and Soul, and all of our listeners. And with that, what are we talking about today? What's on the agenda for today's conversation?
So in the spirit of missing each other and not connecting over the last week, and also I've been having a few conversations with some of my clients. There's something in the air that's telling me this would be a good week to talk about intentional relationships. And what I mean by that is using the intentions that we talk about, like being intentional with our actions and our choices, and using that to guide all different types of relationships that we have, whether it's dating relationships or it's a relationship like you and I, Devon, that we have. I think it's important for people to understand that like we don't have to just like be living in these relationships and just like letting the relationship happen. Like we can take the wheel and be intentional in the different types of relationships that we have in our lives.
I love that. Fully on board with that conversation. I think coming from this weekend that I just came from, or this week of travel, I was just at a bachelorette trip too, and with a bunch of people and people who have been friends with the bride of honor, and seeing how my relationship, how their relationship with her has grown and evolved over the years, or some only developed within the past 2 years. So I love that conversation. You and I are always on similar wavelengths in terms of what we experience, whether that's with clients, personally with ourselves, or with others. So I'm with you there.
I think I really appreciate you so much, Devon, because our relationship, I think we have mutual respect in our relationship of each other's boundaries, of each other's needs. We've explicitly discussed what I can offer, what you can offer. When we get on a call, we start by checking in, and then we're like, okay, what time is your hard stop? We talk about each other's boundaries. We just checked in before we hit record on this call to make sure we're both feeling balanced in the responsibilities that we share with this podcast. And I think just having intentional conversations with people in relationships is so important because we want this relationship to last. We want this relationship to feel sustainable. And in order for that to happen, there has to be balance, there has to be respect, there has to be intention.
I think that's what happens when you bring a therapist and a spiritual teacher together. I think we're like communication, boundaries, honoring each other's like comfort levels. So I couldn't agree with you more. It is really such a breath of fresh air to be working with you and to be sharing this space with you and to be growing our friendship, our partnership in this podcast together. And taking this moment to reflect on it now just makes me feel really proud of both of us because this type of relationship or this way of showing up in relationships, I can speak for myself, was not always me, was not always the way that I showed up in relationships. And I don't think it's the norm actually to be so intentional and to be so conscious in our relationships. So I know that it is a product of the time, the healing, the therapy, all of that across a number of years. Would you agree?
I I do agree. Yeah, and I think it's easier for me personally to have an intentional relationship with you because our relationship is newer. So it's something that like I could be intentional with from the start, with where
It's a
I'm at
really
in
good
my
point.
own like personal healing journey. Like I can't sit here and say that majority of my relationships are intentional relationships. But I think that's why I value the relationship that we have so much because it is one of the few that I was able to mutually work on in that way, if that makes sense. Like you said that you went on this bachelorette trip. There's people in my life that have been around for years and years, and I think it's harder almost sometimes to go back and put boundaries in or go back and have these conversations. Like we've been friends or family members for all 30 years of my life. And now I'm going to start talking to you about these needs that I have or these wants that I have. So I think that's part of the reason why I value our relationship and our friendship so much because we're both on the same page, but because it's newer, it's easier or it feels easier for me to be able to establish these intentional actions.
It's a really important point. And coming back to you initiating this conversation, speaking to conversations that you've been having with clients or things that you've been working through with them in regards to relationships, is that something that you find often is that your clients are looking for guidance on how to set those boundaries or how to be more intentional in relationships, especially the ones that have been long established before any type of healing or therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible. This might be an overgeneralization, but I don't think I've had a single client where I haven't been talking about boundaries to some capacity. And I imagine that we'll probably be able to have like a whole nother episode on boundaries in and of itself, because that's like such an important conversation too. I'm thinking this is a helpful conversation for us to help people realize that like your relationships, if they're feeling all or nothing, all in or all out, it doesn't have to be that way. We can just try to be more intentional and make different choices in our relationships and how we approach our relationships and how we interact with different people. And I think that those are the conversations that I'm having. And that's really what I mean when I say, like, let's talk about intentional relationships.
Mhm.
It's being thoughtful, and we can choose and pause and ask ourselves and check in and take action to make sure that we're tailoring this relationship to fit our needs and the other person's needs so that the relationship works for us. Relationships should be additive. They shouldn't be only work. They shouldn't be draining. They should feel good. We can be proactive and take the reins and make sure that these relationships are serving us and serving all involved.
This is a big one. And when we were just reflecting on our relationship and how it started and how it continues to grow, I mentioned that the way that you and I show up in our relationship is a product of years of therapy, of healing, because you were speaking to a historically people pleasing person. There wasn't a no that came out of my mouth for years. There wasn't a relationship, friendship, partnership that I cut ties with or burned the bridge with. I was all in with all of my relationships almost my whole life. So I fully agree with you because I think I had this fear that if I said no, or if I began to pull away from a friendship or a relationship that I was in, then it would completely burn the bridge, cut the tie. And that fear was definitely a part of my more insecure attachment style. So now that I understand, as you said, that I have the ability to take the reins, to set boundaries for myself, to determine what I value or what I expect or what I look for in each and every one of my relationships, it's so much easier to view relationships as this like spectrum as opposed to maybe the more black and white way of looking at them as I had in the past.
We can't change a relationship or do anything if we don't understand ourselves or have that awareness of what it is that we need. I always used to think that I was the type of person that would just I just had to give all that I could give. And I was expecting that back in my relationships. And then I'd get to this place where I was resentful and frustrated. And I used to think I was this person that just like got to a certain point. I told every single one of my exes that I dated, don't let me get to this point where I fall out of love with you or I can't care anymore. And I always just thought like I was this type of person that gets to this point. But in doing my own healing and my own reflective work, I realized I was just way over pouring into those relationships and not effectively communicating. I wasn't being intentional at all in those relationships. I thought I was being a good partner by giving, 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 but that's not helpful to the other person if I'm then also starting to get resentful that they're not doing the same thing back. So
Mhm.
it's recognizing our part in relationships. It's not only intentionally offering and being respectful to the other person, but it's also reeling ourselves in and making sure we're on the same page with our expectations of each other. And really, just like you said earlier, communicating those things. Like, hey, I'm a chronic people pleaser. I pour everything I have into my relationships. So if you see me doing that, also hold me accountable and let me know that I'm falling back into an old pattern, and that's not good for either of us too. It's not all just like what I expect from you. It's also having that self-awareness and doing the work for me so that I can show up intentionally for you, you know?
Yeah, I it sounds like you are speaking to a past version of me as well too. I think you and I as healers, teachers, therapists, we just have the tendency to give and give and give and it's a beautiful thing, but when it comes to our relationships with others, it can also really hinder us and leave us feeling really drained. And I know that you and I are not alone, people who aren't teachers, healers, therapists, whatever, like it's something that we have a tendency to do is to overgive, as you said, to overpour. And one thing specifically that you mentioned too in your own healing journey was learning how to communicate, how to speak up for yourself, because it wasn't only benefiting you, but it was also benefiting the person or the other people that you've been in relationships with, which is definitely a very important part of being in an intentional relationship. So how did you work through or how did you recognize these patterns? And if you don't mind sharing, what kind of support did you utilize to get to where you are with your relationships now?
I mean, to be honest, I think what do they say? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Like, I kept repeating the same pattern until I finally got sick of it, until I finally was like, this is this is not working. I am like banging my head against a wall and it doesn't work for me. I feel guilty then ending these relationships. Every relationship I ended was like in turmoil for myself because I cared about this person, but also felt frustrated and resentful at the same time. So I finally just got to a point where I was like, something has to change because this isn't working. And I'm the common denominator in all of these relationships. So instead of trying to change these other people, I think I might have to change myself. And that's where, like, I think the healing probably started. It's been an ongoing process. I'm still working on establishing boundaries and trying to be more intentional in my relationships, and it's not always well received. Sometimes I'm seen as a selfish person, or sometimes I have to struggle with saying no to certain things or speaking my mind. But I do have this light where there's some relationships, this relationship with you, Devon, my relationship with my partner, Nick, like I have relationships where I can see how helpful it is to be able to communicate effectively, to be intentional with my actions, and using those relationships that feel so good for me as my motivation to do some of the harder work in those other areas of my life. That's where I think I've been able to make some small shifts. It's definitely harder the longer I've been in a relationship with friends, or the longer my family's been around my whole life. I find sometimes those are actually the harder ones that I have to be consistent in working on. So I don't have a clear answer. It's kind of all over the place, but reminding myself and using the relationships that genuinely feel good as my models and my motivation, that's how I keep making change in other
Mm.
relationships too.
And something that you said in the beginning in regard to how you made that change or how you recognized that you needed to make that change was that you noticed you were receiving the same result or experiencing the same thing over and over again, of feeling like you were constantly giving more than you were receiving. And when people come to me and we have these conversations on relationships too, they tend to be the people who feel that they give more than they receive. They don't quite feel as appreciated or as loved or as supported as they grant or give to others.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that's where, like, we're just not communicating. We're just not being clear, and we're not being intentional. So if we can pause and put in these little small shifts, changes, requests, statements of expressing our need, or whatever that may be, that really helps the relationships be fulfilling on both ends. There's not one person overpouring and then getting resentful. There's not one person that's like, what are you talking about? I didn't know, or I never heard that before. There's clarity if we have these intentional relationships. And I think that's the key piece that we can then decide, okay, once we have clarity, do we want to continue this relationship? And how do we want to continue this relationship? But otherwise, things are foggy and we just don't know.
Exactly. And then the second part of what you said too, in how or what support you had in making these changes in your life to improve your relationships, the way that you showed up in your relationships, was such a good point. In those longer standing relationships that we've had, it's difficult to put a boundary in there or to change the dynamic, because then all of a sudden the other person's like, wait a minute, you're not the same person that I've been in a relationship with for a number of years. But you do see in those relationships that you form later on in life, or fortunately, if you and a longstanding friend, partner, family member is also doing similar inner work, it is very affirming that doing this work, that bringing more conscious awareness and intentionality into your relationships really pays off. It really has an impact on the quality of your relationships.
Absolutely. So, what does this all then look like for you, Devin? How do you make sure that you're having intentional relationships? What advice do you have? What tips do you share with clients?
I like that you call them intentional relationships. I've always called them conscious partnerships or conscious relationships, two different words for the same exact thing. For me, as I mentioned, being a people pleaser, it was always me saying yes to everything. It was always me making sure that I showed up for everybody. And then, similarly, as what you said, I would feel disappointed when I felt like people didn't always show up for me. It wasn't that they weren't showing up for me. It's just that I didn't feel like they were showing up to the degree that I was showing up for them. And for me, the biggest thing was realizing that the reason why I always gave 300% to all of my relationships, why I never burned a bridge or cut a tie, is because I mentioned this earlier in the conversation that it came down to this more anxious attachment style that I had. Another conversation for an upcoming episode, but my fears of abandonment, of losing people, runs very deep. It's very deep seated. So, relationships for me, to any capacity, have always been really challenging for me. So, getting to the root of why I have always felt so insecure, why I've always felt I needed to give in my relationships was huge. That really started to unravel everything for me.
I just want to thank you, Devon, for sharing that, though, because I think that one, that's a really vulnerable thing for you to share with all of us. And two, it's really powerful and it helps me understand you. And I feel more deeply connected to you now after you sharing that. So I just want to like take a moment and honor that like sacred little moment that
Mm.
you did a hard thing and you shared a real truth. And I appreciate you for sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for holding the space for me to share that. And I think it's really important because it is a part of my healing journey. And I know that I'm not alone in experiencing this. Our relationships are such complex parts of our human experience. And I don't think that prior to this healing journey of mine, I was really aware of how much our relationships really reflected our inner world. So, you had asked me what my tips or tricks or what my journey looked like. And it was once I got to that root of why I felt the way that I did in my relationships, I could then turn my attention away from everybody else and just focus it on myself. What did I really need from these relationships? And a lot of the times it was validation, support, belonging, acceptance, all of that. And once I realized that that is what I was seeking, I learned to begin to give it to myself first. And then, likewise, as you mentioned, learning how to communicate that with other people so that I'm feeling heard and understood.
What you're saying is exactly the work that I'll do with clients. People will come in, unfortunately, at the point, not unfortunately, but they'll come in at the point where they're like, all right, something's got to give, something's got to change. Like I've had it up to here with this relationship. And unfortunately, the hard truth in those moments is that my response is like, let's talk about you. We have to better understand what you need, what you're doing, what you're giving. And for these first few moments, it's actually not about that other person at all. It's all about you. And that doesn't feel as good for people because they're like, well, I want to point the finger and I want them to change and I want them to do something differently. But the truth is, relationships are two-way streets or multiple-way streets if it's like a larger dynamic. So we really do have to slow down and sit with ourselves and understand what it is that we want, what it is that we need, and get that clarity internally before we can do anything externally in those intentional relationships. So I guess that would be the thing that I would offer to our audience too, then, is it starts with you. And then you can understand what you need. You likely don't know at this point what you need or what the challenges are in your relationship until you have a little bit more clarity for yourself.
Fully agree with you there. And I love that in both of our worlds, professionally and personally, we continue to just drill home the importance of coming back to yourself. The biggest thing that I've found is that the world, our life experiences, our relationships are just mirroring back to us our inner world. And exactly what you just said speaks to that. So once we have come to that realization, once your clients get down to the bottom, or like I mentioned, get to the core, the root of where these insecurities or where these needs stem from, we do the work. How do we then bring that out into our relationships, because what you mentioned, it's so much easier to start a new relationship once you've already done this work. But the struggle or the challenge is for us to then apply this understanding and this work we've done to our longstanding relationships. So, what does that look like in your field?
Not to oversimplify it, but it's communication. We don't have to know the solution to know that there's a problem. So if we can come to that other person in our relationship and just start honoring our needs and honoring our own thoughts and feelings by communicating them, I think that will then allow us, if nothing else, to feel connected more deeply to that person, to feel more authentically connected to that person, and resolution might come from there. It's really going to depend on the type of relationship, what it is that you're trying to work through, or how you're trying to, you know, my intentional relationships might look different from yours, which will look different from, our listeners. But it's really just being able to slow down, have that understanding of our inner world, and then communicating that effectively to those that we're trying to have these intentional relationships with, I think.
I think one of the more difficult parts about communicating, or for example, saying no, is the need for us to always have a reason why, right? Like if we're saying no, if
Mm.
we're placing a boundary, we oftentimes feel the need to be like, no, I can't go because XYZ. And I don't know about you, but that's been one of the biggest things for me is always feeling like I needed an excuse to say no, or for why I wanted to leave an event early, or why I couldn't be somewhere. Do you find that as well?
I do. I think that's something that I really personally struggle with. I have a really hard time not over explaining myself or not offering unnecessary information when I'm establishing a boundary. And I think, again, there's probably work for me to do there. I'll put it in my therapy note that, like, it comes back to, like, me not feeling worthy enough that I have to offer you a reason why, or I'm concerned or overly anxious about what you're going to think of me, so I have to offer or over offer that information. But I think there's, again, that's the inner work. That's me projecting my stuff onto you in setting that boundary.
So, how do we, and I would love to hear your take on this, and I'll offer mine too. How do we set the boundary without over explaining, but without sounding like a total asshole?
I'm having two thoughts. One is, I think the first thought is, I think we really do, not to like really like beat this point in here, but we really do have to like be paying attention more and try to be proactive in these conversations, spending the time being thoughtful about what I need or what's too much for me will help me create a plan. Like if we're nervous or going into a party and we know we have to leave early, I would think through like, what is it that I want to say? What is the line that I don't want to cross? And that way we're like kind of planning ahead, because this doesn't come natural, at least at first for me. So I have to kind of like plan ahead. Like, what do I want to say? What's my boundary? What line do I want to try not to cross? So having some sort of like plan of attack, I think, is one piece of this. And two, you can have a boundary and not be an asshole. You can have a boundary and communicate that this boundary is protective of both of us. I say setting boundaries is kind of like a sandwich, and you want two fluffy, nice pieces of bread on each side. So it's the compliment or the cushion or the nice thing of, hey, I love you. I care deeply about you. This has been an amazing party. Boundary. I have to leave. It's my time to go. Fluffy piece of bread. Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to see you soon. You know?
Yeah, and this is making me think, have you ever read the book? It's an old book, The Four Agreements.
No.
You got to read it. I got to revisit it. There's actually five agreements now, but back when the four agreements first came out, there were two, and these are just like guidelines for how to live most peacefully, joyfully, etc. And I remember the first two agreements, I believe, are one, be impeccable with your word. So that all comes back down to communication. As I mentioned, as somebody who was a chronic people pleaser, I would always say yes, or I would always have to, if I had to say no, make up some wild excuse. And being impeccable with your word is communicating, like you've just said, if you're leaving an event early, for example, you set the boundary, I'm heading out, and then the fluff, I've had a long day, I'm really tired, I've had so much fun, and I would love to see you again soon. As opposed to making up some excuse like, oh, grandma is calling me right now. She needs me to go over and take the dog out. Not that I've ever used that excuse, but I'm just saying is like being impeccable with your word is speaking your truth. And yeah, adding some fluff, but not with the intention of making the other person feel better. It's best when it is still your truth. And then the second part of that is not taking anything personally. So that's a big one
Mm.
because we love to take everything personally. So when it comes to setting that boundary, when it comes to communicating our truth, oftentimes we project thinking that the other person is going to take something personally. So, for example, this leaving a party early or leaving an event early, we project our fears thinking that the person whose party we're leaving is going to take it personally, be really mad at us. Whole night is ruined. We shouldn't have left to begin with. But by following this agreement, we learn to understand that we are all honestly just looking out for ourselves. We're just trying to do the best that we can with what we have. Nothing is actually about the other person, it's all just projections of our inner world. So when it comes to boundary setting, remembering not to take somebody else's actions personally is just as big as understanding that it's not your responsibility to put so much weight into how somebody else will react when you set a boundary.
Yeah, the fluff, the bread, the fluffy bread, it's not bullshit. It's just it's authentic truth, it's kindness, it's real. It doesn't have to be a lie. It doesn't have to be a story that you're making up. It's just honoring, I care about you. I understand you're kind of trying to cushion the boundary for the other person, not in a people pleasing way, but it's hard to hear no. It's hard to be rejected. It's hard to see someone that we care about leaving our party. So you're just communicating honestly with that person in that moment. You're not lying to them. You're not lying to yourself. You're just coming from a place of like, I know that this might be hard for you to hear. And I want to soften that for you because I care. But I think it's important that the fluffy bread is real and honest and not fabricated or, some narrative that we're telling ourselves.
This is a big topic. This is a really important conversation to have. I know that we could have and we will have an entire episode dedicated towards setting boundaries. So, as we begin to wrap up this episode on intentional relationships, what is one tool or tip that you can leave our audience with in terms of forming or establishing intentional relationships?
I know that you guys are probably not going to think this is a tool or a tip. My advice would be to pause. Don't just react. Don't just say something immediately. Like pause and breathe before responding. I think if you're a people pleaser, your knee jerk reaction is people please or make the other person comfortable. So instead of doing that, breathing and pausing and then deciding, what do I want to do with this moment?
As we always disclose, these suggestions are easier said than done, but I do find that to be a really important one. So thank you for that, Heather. And my tool tip is actually going to be reiterating something that you said, because maybe for those who are listening, they haven't yet established or brought awareness to what a conscious or intentional relationship looks like. And so, to reiterate something that you said, look to those relationships that you do have where the other person honors your boundaries, where you don't have to find excuses for, you don't have to over explain yourself, where it feels like an even give and take, because we all have those relationships somewhere, and they can serve as such great models for the kinds of relationships that you want more of. So, thank you for offering that one as well that I'm going to run with. I think that was a really important one too.
A lot of what we said was important. And I think there's pieces of this that are challenging to speak to, because every relationship is unique in its own way. Every person is going to have their own needs and intentions and boundaries. So it's hard to like generalize all of the things that we're saying. But I think there was a lot of little nuggets of wisdom, if you will, in this
Always.
episode that we shared.
Always.
So, Devon, it is your turn to take a look up at your vision board and share with us what it is that is calling out to you today.
The first word that I saw when I looked up is just one single word, and it's the word sanctuary. And I think that that word is a great descriptor of how I feel in friendships or relationships that are intentional, conscious, aligned for me. Is a sanctuary is a peaceful place for you to be without worry, without stress. And that's how these relationships feel. That's how my relationship feels with you, at least, is that I don't feel like I have to put on a front. I feel that our relationship is very reciprocal, that I can be honest with you, that you honor my boundaries, that I honor yours. With that, I hope that everybody finds, creates, establishes those relationships that feel like a sanctuary, a safe space for you.
I love that. I think that's so true. And it's sacred, it's important, it's balanced, it's well, and it feels comfortable and like home. And that's what I think we're all aiming for. So being intentional with our relationships will only help them, not hurt them.
Yep.
So, one last thing that we wanted to add in here at the end of this episode is that we found this fun little feature on Spotify. So, if you listen to our podcast on Spotify, there's a way where the show notes are for us to add in polls and questions for you guys, our audience, to engage and listen and interact with us in fun little ways. So, at the end of this episode, take a look into the show notes section to see any questions or polls that we might have included in there, because we'd love to hear what you think and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yes, we would love to hear from you. And thank you again, Heather, for yet another great episode. Really love all of these conversations that we've been having. And we will see you again next week for episode 8.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Bye.
We are so glad that you took the time to share this space with us. We'll be releasing new episodes of Mind Meets Body and Soul every Tuesday, so be sure to give us a follow and share this podcast with those you love.
To connect with us and join our communities, head to the show notes where you'll find our contact information and individual websites. Until next week, stay grounded, keep growing, and trust that everything you seek is unfolding for you.